Then this is pretty much the convention too, that we have init with name colon, and we pass it the name. And notice now we are passing a second argument, so space and age colon age. So the name of this method is init with name colon and age colon. That name and age are arguments. Those are not part of the name of the method. So we already see how these names can get pretty long. Believe me when I say that there are method names that are like 4 times longer than this in iOS dealings that you will be using. So there's one other, I don't remember. Questions? Yes, it's very similar to void star, except it's dealing with objects instead of general pointers. And we'll see ID in other places too. And it's also similar to void star in that automatic casting happens.
Could you just go over that one time?
This whole thing? OK. So we have instance method. It is returning an ID. So that's just the way it is. If you wanted, you could say student star. But you shouldn't. You should say ID, because any initialization method pretty much returns ID. Then the convention is that you're going to init, and then with is also pretty much the convention. Any colon, you can count the colons to determine the number of arguments to a function. So here we see 2 colons. That means we know there are going to be 2 arguments. The first argument is called name and is of type NSString star. The second argument is called age and is of type int. So when we want to actually call this function, we might say, like, well, first we allocate a student, and then we say student init with name colon at Bob space and age colon 21. And we'll see an example of that in another student's 4 or 5 or whatever. So the answer is no, but that should never be the case. Because if the variables are different, this naming scheme should be different. This is how you name methods in, like, all method names are very long and explicit in Objective-C. And so if we decided that instead we wanted to just initialize with the name, then we would have an init with name method without the and age. If we wanted to just do name, we would have an init with age method without the and name or whatever. Yeah. That was a typo that has been fixed. These will be uploaded at the end. There are some changes. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah. We would just put more. And gender and year and whatever. It's the number of colons specifies. In theory, we don't need to say and age. Like a valid method name is init colon colon, which because there are 2 colons, we expect there to be 2 arguments. And so we can call it with like init colon Bob colon 20. But that's not what you should do in Objective-C. You should explicitly name all of your parameters. So init with name colon whatever and age colon whatever.
Like in JavaScript, can you pass in like an object or a dictionary or something?
You cannot by default pass in a dictionary or object or anything like that. This is pretty much the only way you can run it, unless you happen to define an initialization method that like takes what we'll see later, like an NS dictionary. But that's up to you to define such an initialization method. But you pretty much shouldn't. This is the way it should be. And also, if you follow this convention, I'm pretty sure Xcode is going to give you some more advanced tips in auto completions and stuff. The convention being like, this should return ID. This should start with the 4 letters init. And when someone's reading your code, they expect you to initialize something, so they should see the 4 letters init. Okay. Looking at this example. Six. Okay, so in student.h, we see we are now declaring a new method, exactly what we saw before. Now that we have said that we are using this method, we need to implement that method in the .m file. So here, let's first look at the init with name. So this is a very common pattern. Whenever you define your own initializer, this is pretty much the pattern you want to take, where the for a second, let's say this first. So this is somewhat weird from other languages where like self is just sort of like a keyword. Here, self is a variable, and you're assigning to that variable the result of initializing your superclass. So again, this is part of the pattern that you pretty much always do. So just because I happen to inherit from NSObject, which its initialization method does nothing, but imagine that it does do something. So just because I know how I want to be initialized doesn't mean I know how my parent class wants to be initialized. So you should always call your parent class an initializer of your parent class. So the reason we assign to self and do this whole if self equals superinit thing is under some bizarre scenario where initializing the superclass manages to return nil or something, like initialization went wrong, then we don't want to do these two things. As an example, maybe we just happen to define the initializer as like only 5 objects of this class type should ever be initialized. After 5, it should just fail. And so then when they try to initialize, if it's after 5, presumably this super init is going to fail, and self will be nil, and then we'll just return self. Yes?
Is self similar to this in Java?
Yes, yes, yes. Self, this are two things you see in languages. There is no this in Objective-C. They just call it self. It means this current object. So when I have a student, like I just allocated a student, and then I pass that student the message init with name whatever, then self refers to that student I just passed the message to. And so similarly, self.age, which is also equivalent to self set age age. So self.age refers to this student. We want to set our own age instance variable to age.
Do you need to spell out the original init function or is it just following any init with something?
Which do you need to spell out? Spell out. Oh, this? So this gets into that there should always be, and you can look up these exact words, designated initializer. So not really going to go into deep detail here, but every class should have exactly one designated initializer. And this is, in other languages, you might see it as like you define one constructor that sort of all other constructors that you have call. And so here, we decide that init with name should be our designated initializer, which means that init needs to call our designated initializer. If we then defined a id inits with age method, that should be int, then this must also call our designated initializer, and we'll use the defaults up above, John, and age. So there should always be one initializer, which is your designated initializer. And also, that designated initializer needs to call the designated initializer of your parent class. So notice that init and init with age are not calling super init. It's only our designated initializer which is calling super init. So that's just, if you start defining your own initializers, just make sure you follow this convention, and you can remember it just Googling designated initializer. And also notice that I should not do this. Why is it? I should not do this because this is not appropriately setting self. So we want to set self to whatever that happens to return, and then return self. Questions? And then going back to main, now we see that all in one line, you're allocating a student, initializing it with the name Alice and the age 20.
Sorry, can you explain why we use super
In here.
Yeah.
So imagine we are, go back to the example from a while ago where we have like NS object, then we have person, then we have student, then we have 8th grader. So I want to define a new initialization method for 8th grader. And I decide that to initialize it, like say it has an instant 8th graders, let's say kindergartner. So kindergartner has an instance variable favorite color. And so we decide that like the default value for that instance variable should be blue. So we define an initializer that says this should be blue, except if we don't then call super init, super now refers to, if we are a kindergartner, super refers to student. And so if we don't call super init, then we're not initializing all these instance variables that happen to come from the student class and the person class and the NS object class. So you should always initialize your superclass, similar to like you should always initialize any object that you allocate. You should always initialize your superclass. And these two methods happen to initialize the superclass by calling the designated initializer, which initializes the superclass. But again, this pattern, like this is the pattern for writing your own initializer. So you should almost always copy and paste this, and then like in these curly braces is where you set your instance variables, or NSLog, whatever it is you want to NSLog.
So they would always just initialize the super.
Yeah. Because there might be something in that superclass that is like essential for everything else to work. Any other questions?
Why again is that the function low? Why does it not need the super?
Why does init with age not need it? Because it's calling init with name and age. It's calling this method, which itself calls super init. Okay, we'll take the 5-minute break. Okay, so am I now louder? So now talk about collections for just a second. The only ones we're going to see right now are this NS array and NS mutable array, where NS array is an immutable array, which pretty much means like once it exists, it is what it is. You can't change it. Mutable array is going to be useful that we're going to be able to just keep adding things to it. NS dictionary and NS mutable dictionary. So those are going to be useful for like key value pair type stuff, associative arrays, maps, whatever, hash tables, whatever you want to call them. That's what you're going to use those for. Sets, just another example of a collection. NS array is going to be the most commonly used, and we're going to use it right here. So looking at the next example. Okay, so students.h and students.m haven't changed.